of the government and our ministry in particular to be able to plant large scale, so that we need human skills, we need nurseries, something that currently we lack. We currently have in operation only one full scale high quality nursery, but we're very happy that outside of the government and public initiatives there are organizations such as ATP. There's new organization now soon to be open in Armenia officially, My Forest, which is also aiming to open up nurseries. So it's also an important aspect of building the capacity to produce nurseries, to have nurseries to produce the needed saplings for the planting of the trees, large scale planting of the trees. So again, 260,000 hectares on average in Armenia. We've been planting 3,000 trees per hectare. So I guess we could do the math of one tree costing with its maintenance about $1. But it comes to a pretty serious figure. But again, the upfront cost and investment that would be needed would be the initial phase. But then we believe with the right technologies, and one of the reasons we're also partnering with FAST Foundation, the Foundation for Armenian Science and Technology, is to give us the necessary tools to ensure that we monitor and we use the best available technologies to optimally do the work that we plan to do.
Okay, thank you. With my basic math skills, the number is coming to 1 billion, yeah?
Close to
$980 million, yeah, something like
around
that.
780, yeah.
Okay, so actually, do you have in mind some sources how the government should secure those funding?
Absolutely. Well, again, referring back to the Paris Agreement, as Armenia has taken the commitments, it has also become part of the global family to expect support from developed nations globally in mitigation, both mitigation and adaptation measures. So Armenia over the past more than a year has been working on developing a climate finance mechanism, which I hope we'll have an opportunity to elaborate further. But the idea is that, well, first of all, as we know under Paris Agreement, developed nations have taken also the commitment to start mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020 for climate change needs and adaptation mitigation needs. And we know that, unfortunately, a lot of countries fell short of it, but we also know that there are very few working platforms and mechanisms to mobilize this type of money, the scale and size of this money. And just to give you a very basic figure, besides mobilization, the disbursement is also a problem. I happen to serve on the board of the Green Climate Fund, representing our constituency, which is 9 countries. The Green Climate Fund's board is comprised of 12 developing and 12 developed nations representing larger constituencies. And during our last board meeting, we had a report presented to us whereby, although we know that GCF has, in the first replenishment, has had $7 billion committed and $5 billion already allocated for climate-related projects, unfortunately, only 9% of that has been dispersed. So that's a worrying number, something that currently the GCF Secretariat is working hard to ensure that the disbursement pace and in general the pace is accelerated. But again, this is alarming because climate change is not waiting. Actually, we're seeing more and more acceleration of a lot of what has been forecasted 10, 20 years away from now. So again, coming back to the pace and time, we are running out of time. So this was one of the concerns at the heart of the principles of the climate finance mechanism that we've been working on. The other principle that is at the heart of this mechanism is debt for nature or debt for climate swap. These mechanisms have been employed in the past, but the difference of the one that we have proposed, and actually we had the opportunity to present it in a written format during the climate summit, this past climate summit in New York on September 23rd. And these two important components, debt for climate swap and time, But what makes it different is that we suggest that countries work on a bilateral level. So, for example, take Armenia. In Armenia's sovereign debt structure, we have close to $1 billion, which is on a bilateral level. So, and our 5 main debt partners are France, Germany, Japan, Russia, and UAE. And we're working now. We already started negotiations with France. The upside of this project is that of this mechanism is that the developed countries are also interested because they also get to meet the commitments under the Paris Agreement to disperse this money, but they will have more control of it because they'll work on a bilateral level directly with the country and have more say in the way these funds will be spent. Also, we know that there's a very limited concessional and non-concessional credit limits for developing countries. And again, the other component, as I already mentioned, is time. We're running out of time. These countries, like Armenia, developing countries, will all have debts. We will all be paying them in time, in 20, 30, 40 years, but we don't have that time for climate change adaptation and mitigation needs. So here comes this mechanism. We're very happy that it was received positively, and we're happy that we're already started the negotiation phase with France. And we believe that should this mechanism work successfully for Armenia, we can certainly scale it up to other developing countries and globally.
Okay, thanks. Since we are here, have kind of a new mega project for Armenia, and my next question is to Ms. Carmen Lopez. Actually, you have very interesting sequence of experience working for the same GCF, and currently you work for FAO. And can you kind of share some recommendations with the representative of government and all of us, how to secure those fundings? Which are the main directions of financing the government should pursue, and what need to be done for that?
Yeah. Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today, and I would like to first refer to the financial mechanism that Irina was mentioning. Actually, Armenia is pioneering by suggesting, in the context of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, what will be this type of financial mechanism. And then this mechanism consists of 2 components. One first component that is the internal or domestic finance, that it's thought to be a climate revolving civil fund that will be replenished on permanent basis by allocations from environmental fees and ecosystem services fees, and including carbon taxing. And then the other part of the mechanism is referring to the external finance or the international support. And I would like to show you a slide on what are the sources of climate finance that are available. So you have an idea of, if we can go to the first slide, please. So you have an idea of what is being offered internationally. So if you see the first row, you have the contributors. So you have the developed countries who are providing support. Most of these have already commitments in terms of official aid that they are providing, and then climate finance should be additional to that. And that is something that is very clear in the context of the nationally determined contribution that Armenia submitted to the United Nations Convention, that international finance should be additional to what was already committed to development aid. And then most of these contributors are working through the development agencies, but also they are contributing to the financial mechanism under the convention. And there you have the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the Global Environmental Facility, which are already big financial instruments, but you also have other types of finance that is flowing in the multilateral context. And I would like to go to the second slide just for you to see how the funds are flowing. So you have the contributors, and then you have the way this is flowing through agencies, national agencies, bilaterally, multilaterally, through climate funds. Then you have the commercial. This is this gray greenish part here, and then you have project developers and so on. Then if you see the big part here is private finance or flowing to private stakeholders. And then if you see the other part is adaptation, cross-cutting, and mitigation. And then if you compare the share that goes to private sector and to mitigation, you will see that most of the resources are going to mitigation with private sector participation. And then in that sense, you asked me for recommendations, and I just wanted to set the scene for these lessons that we have learned when working with climate finance. The first one is that very strong in-country coordination is crucial to accessing these resources. And then also discussing with different stakeholders, what does it mean transformational for the Armenian context? What does it mean a paradigm shift? That is a very Green Climate Fund slang, but I think it's pertinent for the discussions in Armenia as well. What does it mean a transformational project? It is not the same for Armenia than for my country, El Salvador. So a thorough discussion on what it means and what do you need to actually develop transformational projects is it's crucial. Then also I think the other recommendation is to understand and explore all types of financial instruments. It's very important. Of course, most countries are targeting grants, but there are other opportunities, not only loans, but also, and I try to look for the forestry sector specifically, because there are a lot of risks related to investments in the forestry sector. There is risk guarantees, special risk insurances, and other types of financial instruments that could be explored, and that is one of the key recommendations, because in the case of the Green Climate Fund and other financial mechanisms, and as you saw in the slide, private sector will have a key role in mobilizing this climate finance for forestry and for all the sectors related to mitigation and adaptation. So understanding these financial instruments it's a key element. And then, as I already mentioned, well, the private sector has a key role and will be not only receiving but contributing to these flows of climate finance. Also understanding how to engage and how to leverage private sector participation. It's another key recommendation that we're giving to all governments. Understanding the political, socioeconomic, market, weather, and climate risks that are representing a barrier for private sector investment in forestry, it's a must. And I think that as we are walking the climate finance walk, most countries are already exploring these options and trying to understand how to effectively leverage. But one key element is that we cannot trust on external aid only. So identifying whether the sources of domestic finance, it's important, and that's why I was saying that that Armenia is pioneering in that, because it's already proposing to the convention ways to do that, ways to identify domestic sources of finance. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. Actually, as Irina also mentioned, this is not only a problem of financing, but also tools and also how to engage private sector, because we need to kind of accumulate also internal resources, but also we need the experience of private sector, which is kind of more sustainable, yeah, and based on this pragmatic forecasting and experience. So my next question is to Diana, my colleague, who knows in this close cycle as Miss Climate, yeah, of Armenia. So, what kind of recommendations you also can give in the scope of the accumulating resources and also capacity to implement the plans mentioned by previous panelists?
Thank you, Mark. To be honest, there was Yeah. Just to be honest, I'm for 20 years I am working under climate change program with UNDP, but all these ideas about the reforestation and targets were placed by the former focal point for UNFCCC, Mr. Irina Ղափլանյան, when in the first national communication there was a study on paleontological data and experts. We have prominent experts in forestry sector who was looking for the historical areas where the reforestation, the Armenia was forested, and the in long centuries ago, the Armenia was forested by 40%. So the conditions are there. Of course, the conditions with climate change are changed. But we have to understand also that the ground must be plowed not only for seeds, but also for efforts. And for this, there is homework that we have to do. And the international organizations are starting to do is that we have to have perfect maps on the areas where it's possible to do reforestation. Money is flowing where there is ground is prepared. So there is a proper homework. When, as a deputy minister mentioned, we have to have nursery, we have to have the public funding. And for this civic fund idea is also good, because there is a time when the taxes from environment were much higher than inputs in the environment. So it's time to return to the nature. So this is opportunity, because the forest can be not looked only as a wood, but also as an environment and as also survival for the agriculture and other things for water saving, because we are facing this in deforested areas. That's why this public awareness, and if we are calculating how much finance we need for reforestation, we have to understand that it's time also to increase the community's responsibility for this process. And when I was looking for this plenary, I went back to the history when we was preparing under Kyoto Protocol CDM project for Armenia, and there was no such a political will to have such a champion agency to do this work. And our neighbors in the area, Moldova, succeeded, and they have 8,500 hectares project started yet in 2006. And the main core thing was that there was an agency who was have an agreement with communities to use communal land, because we also to understand that if we have such an ambitious goal, it must be not only the lands that are under the governmental control, but the lands that are under community control. And to engage communities and broad public in this ambitious target is very critical. And in this case, as Ms. Carmen mentioned, usually the finance for climate is coming as an additional to domestic funds. So it's very good that for this year the government has allocated the budget, significant amount of budget for reforestation and forest protection area. And for several years we was facing that the forests were left, all forest agency was left without budget support, and they have to earn through the selling wood. And this is not a way for Armenia. And also we have to be realistic that we are not rainforest, and so we are out from the GF Global Environmental Facility funding, because for GF7 there is a source of program approach, but it's the target countries are with rainforest. So we have to make attractive our reforestation program with making groundwork. With the nurseries, with domestic funding, with civic participation. And in this case, we can be able to attract also the donors. And from private investment part, we can consider that we have a lot of opportunities for the Armenian diaspora support, but we also to understand that current private sector also, which is operating and gaining all benefits from the natural resources, have to participate in this, because for example, companies who are having profits for the mineral water or spring water bottle business have to understand that preserving forest is preserving their income, and to involve them in such type of activities, and to increase the responsibility of mining companies for remuneration or the left and not used the tailings and mines areas, because these are areas which can be, for example, attractive and easy, because there will be no tenure issue. And the most important, as yesterday I was lecturing about importance of energy efficiency and compared to renewable energy, it's important to understand that we have to not forget the protection issue, because the protection is much cheaper than replanting and bringing the seedlings to the forest the category. So we have to protect our forests, and all these efforts that was done this year are by police, by Ministry of Environment, by the local governors are important, and we have to increase this responsibility for all people for the protection, because here are also the peasants who are using the forest for grazing, and if we are going for reforestation with such an ambitious targets, maybe we will not be able to fence all these replanted areas. So we have to understand how all these works have to be coordinated. So this is for now, but as a UNDP, we have prepared the action plans for the foresters in the north. We have projects in the south for reducing the forest fires and pest control, and all these issues are the protection, and but also we have to understand that we can reduce the fragmentation of the forest, making forest more healthy, because in a forest fund and in the forested areas we have a lot of degraded areas which can be on the first order replanted. In this case, the forest will be more healthy as an ecosystem because it will be less fragmented. And here there is also the political will to involve them and to understand how the land tenure and land category change have to be very strictly controlled, because we have the process when the category of forest lands are easily transferred under construction or under the bad tendency we have also now under solar PV stations, and to understand how strict must be the law for this forest category change. So this is also not to reduce the space for reforestation.
Thank you, Diana. And actually, I know that UNDP is kind of piloting several projects to show in the same private sector what this forestry sector is also tractable. And can you share some of this experience?
The one is this the climate hackathons that was organized, and to bring the ideas of the private sector involvement. Another is that Vahagn is leading. It's that for innovative financing for the house crowdfunding for the forest reforestation activities. These are ideas which are piloting different opportunities which need to be very scrutinally analyzed and scaled. These are because UNDP's capacity and is looking on opportunities for development. It's we are not as a specialized agency for forestry as FAO can be, but we are looking on a forest activities and reforestation from the point of view of development, which is very critical for Armenian rural communities.
Okay, thank you. And actually, also from our experience, my next question is to Mr. Rouge. Blending like public and private finance, it's a very kind of brings a lot of kind of complex, problems to solve. Actually, one of them is to have the good baseline and then to set the measurement metrics in order to make effective those investments. Yeah, and actually, if we consider what the finance is in place, actually, what are your recommendations? How to set those impact measurement framework and then get the maximum out of those investments and to secure us from possible risks, of not using that in very effective way.
Yeah, I mean, you've identified a very critical problem or critical challenge. Is that working?
Yes.
Yeah. No?
Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
We can change.
Try. Keep trying. Hello? Oh yeah, I think that's. Is that working? Not very much.
No.
Keep trying.
Can we change please?
Can we just change places? Thank you. Yeah, so you've identified a critical issue. Good data is important for so many reasons in this entire process, and that's data about project management as well as impacts. And I think you can see from many of these funds that were being talked about are very much orientated towards the sorts of environmental impact we're going to have with the actions that are being proposed. And commonly this is how have emissions been reduced. So we've got to be able to measure to some greater or lesser extent what it is we intend to achieve. So I mean, broadly speaking, I think the challenge that we're facing here in Armenia right now is for the next sort of strategic period, 20 or 30 years, how much forest of what type do we need and where do we need it? And by going through that process of really sort of understanding, do we need forest for production, forestry for fuel wood, or do we need forest for ecosystem service benefits? We start to actually then identify the impact and performance framework that we need to measure and monitor. And this is true at different spatial scales, from the national level right down to individual projects. I think a lot of the way that the climate focus or environmental focus of a lot of this type of financing really naturally leads us towards what are our performance of our programs in relation to biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services in addition to carbon. But I think we also need to really concentrate on issues to do with the sort of social and economic metrics as well. And I think increasingly this is important because these funds are not just looking for performance in the sort of carbon reduction realm, but they're also applying criteria and metrics associated with the social and biodiversity safeguards. So we need to at least know that the investments we're making aren't making people worse off. So in that sense, there's a process issue, and doing sort of very robust research at different levels, from the national level right down to individual projects. Getting people involved in the collection and analysis of data, getting them involved in monitoring processes, also helps to improve the level of governance and transparency in the actions that we're planning, and also in terms of achieving the outcomes that we're planning for. And that's particularly important. I think we've heard from some of our speakers, I think there's pretty much a technological solution to every problem that Armenia faces. And we can gather the information we need from around the world, locally as well, and global data is there that we can reassess and reanalyze in the context of Armenia. But really, the biggest challenges are putting these technological solutions into practice, and that's all down to people and systems. And I think what we're probably looking for here is the biggest sort of social impact, the biggest effect in our rural economies. And certain options that we pursue might be better than others. So, we need to work on generating data at every level that's appropriate for the management decisions we're making at these different levels. I think also the important thing to note is, we've talked about forestry. It's a very long-term investment. And so we know where we are today and we know where we want to be in 20 or 30 years from now. But what are the milestones and things that we're trying to achieve along the way? Because I think the biggest challenge with forestry as sort of a transformative sector is that we can set up expectations that are not really realizable within political cycles. And, great ideas fail to achieve the traction they need because people can't see the sort of short-term benefits. And also this is where a lot of sort of climate financing comes into play. So if we're looking at sort of carbon and emissions reductions performance, a lot of the sort of funds for climate change are really looking to develop payments for performance frameworks. So that's where disbursements are made upon an agreed set of understanding the long-term nature of the impacts. Agreements and disbursements are actually centered around how well we've done in doing what we said we were going to do. And, if we've achieved all of the sort of management targets that we set ourselves, that will unlock the next tranche of funding. So, data, it's important for so many reasons. I mean, initially, it's, robust project planning or program or strategic planning and management. And then it's also the impact assessment. Did we, really manage to achieve what we set out to do? And I think, this is also critical for the private sector. I mean, a lot of this data and this research is really helping to assess and understand risk in the investments that we're going to make. And, that's particularly of interest for the private sector because they're looking for returns on their investment and they have to guarantee their investors some sort of return. And so they want to see, I think, from national governments or jurisdictional entities that they've done their homework, that they've got a very coherent and concrete sort of theory of change between the activities that they're proposing and some sort of environmental or social outcome. So, these are experiences we're sort of having in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I've been particularly working on this with the Green Climate Fund coordination unit in the national government, and particularly we've been looking at how to get the private sector more engaged in sort of delivering on some of these emissions reductions targets that they have at the national level.
Yeah, actually interesting. And considering the kind of long-term, like payback period, compared with long payback period, actually the collaboration needed between private and public sector, yet some kind of blend of soft and hard money. And can you recommend some concrete mechanisms? Yeah, kind of we talk about the performance-based mechanism or success-based payment, which are currently kind of piloting in other developing countries, which can be also kind of applied in our country.
Well, yeah, okay. So speaking now sort of more technically as an economist, we tend to argue for incentive-based mechanisms, and so a lot of work really needs to be done on understanding the behavioural preferences of the actors, and understanding also the social systems, the institutions and organisations that are there to implement this type of funding, or need to be there to implement this type of funding successfully. And having a very sort of detailed knowledge and understanding of your local and national government systems can help also to understand what type of sort of market-based mechanisms are the right ones for you. And I think, we've basically got three types of interventions you can make: taxes, regulations, and voluntary type of agreements. Nobody's really fond of taxes. Regulations are often costly to implement, and that leads us, to globally now sort of a trend towards trying to, really promote these voluntary agreements, which are things like payments for ecosystem service programs, payments for performance programs, and this is where, a government or a private body that has some sort of jurisdiction over an area of land is trying to get an outcome, and if that outcome is affected by lots of different local actors, what could be incentives to get them to jump on board with the reforestation program. And that could be things like, grants to promote certain types of investments, tax relief to encourage certain types of investments, or it could be direct payments, to local communities to reforest and manage land. So, there's lots of examples from around the world. I think Costa Rica is, I think is a particularly relevant example where they've really transformed their forest environment. In the 1980s, they had a huge reduction in forest cover, down to only just less than 30% of the national land area, and they were having terrible problems with erosion and hydrological management problems because of the loss of forests, and that was really to stimulate the cattle industry. And then in the early 90s, they decided they needed to do something about this, and they started initiating the first payments for ecosystem service program payments. And today, they're now at 57% forest cover as a result of that program. So it's been hugely transformative, and all the challenges that we're having with erosion and hydrological management have now largely been resolved. And this is an environment where there's not really large scale. It's a mountainous country, very much like Armenia. There's not really large scale industrial agriculture, and so they've done this through multiple payments to a multitude of small farmers. So I think the future is bright. We just have to identify the critical institutional and social bottlenecks to achieving these outcomes.
Thank you. Ms. Ghaplanyan, what do you think? Is it kind of realistic in the short term to apply those mechanisms mentioned by Glenn and others? Maybe you already tried like green bonds or other kind of innovative financing tools to achieve this bright future, to come to bright future in the short time, as we have a shortage of time in climate adaptation, as you mentioned previously.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for bringing the incredible example of Costa Rica. Indeed, the transformation of that country over the past few decades has been exceptional, but there are incredible preconditions for Costa Rica to do that. The country is fourth in the world with the volume of precipitation. So that's why they're about 99% renewable energy in that country. We're not close yet. Armenia's energy structure, we're 30% renewable, but with a very ambitious plan to increase significantly that portion because we're just tapping into our solar potential. So definitely Costa Rica is something to look at. But again, they also had another important precondition in the 60s and 70s. They virtually closed down their military and redirected a lot of these funds for socioeconomic programs and environmental programs. So unfortunately, Armenia is not in a position to, free up that much budget in its country to redirect somewhere. But again, thank you, Glenn, for bringing up the very important aspect of socioeconomic elements needed to be in environmental projects. So definitely, when, for example, GCF looks at any projects that are on the table, there has to be climate rationale, and there has to be this idea of additionality. And absolutely, for Armenia, that's the case because as we look historically at the trends, the biggest pressure on the forests were when the countries, in particularly rural areas, experienced highest levels of poverty. So for us, alleviating the pressure on the forest has to go hand in hand with socioeconomic aspects of every project. That's just to reflect on important points that were raised. Since I've had the opportunity of reflecting on that, let me also come back to what Carmen mentioned about coordination mechanism and how it is important. We also prioritize this because, as Glenn mentioned, these things have to be systemic. We have to have the ground work done. Diana also reflected on that, and absolutely that's a priority for the government. So there's a government decree that established Climate Council in the country back in 2015. This important mechanism hasn't been that active, but it's a great mechanism for us to use as a coordination mechanism because, as you know, particular adaptation projects pertain to every sector of livelihood. It's not just, environmental projects, reforestation, etc. It's urban planting, it's transport, it's healthcare, etc. So in the National Adaptation Plan, which is again funded by Green Climate Fund, and in the framework of our NDC partnership plan, we're developing an updated elements to the Climate Council, where we want to have a stronger coordination mechanism within it. We want to raise its political decision making. Currently, it's on a deputy minister and ministerial level. We want to raise it because at the end of the day, once we pass through the national adaptation, we have the National Adaptation Plan. The idea is to incorporate climate rationale in almost all of the national political decision making. And then it obviously brings me back again to financing. Another element that we brought into one of our projects, and we've already consulted with Ministry of Finance, is incorporating the so-called climate budget tagging. We need to understand how much government is actually spending on climate-related projects. So we do show to the world that and to our donors that there is co-financing once we know how much it is from the government. So there are a lot of important elements that are incorporated in a number of projects that the government is currently undertaking. And one definitely important aspect as well is the coordination mechanism that we're putting in. And one last thing, Diana, thank you so much for bringing up the aspect of community lens. Again, all of these mega projects have to be implemented in synergy and together with communities. And again, we're constantly looking also at the currently very recently updated IPCC's land use guidance. It's very important also for Armenia because we're not an exception. A lot of lands belong to the community, and we need to work with them together. And here where we see various creative mechanisms that could engage and incentivize communities to work with us on reforestation measures, such as, working together with them in planting high value crops, for example, hazelnuts or wild apples and pears, and then some share of the land allocating for reforestation, something like that, where communities definitely feel incentivized. The socioeconomic aspect is figured into the project, and we all benefit.
Thank you. Can you bring an example of collaboration with the private sector, actually, or trials? It's successful, unsuccessful, and which are the main obstacles, to engage the private sector, because it will help also government to turn from this input-based budgeting to performance-based budgeting. So this could be done only if we have showcases and success stories working with the private sector.
Yes, thank you. Actually, let me tap into the energy sector because it's one of the recent most successful projects, and that's the Masrik 1 solar power plant. It's a PPP project together with the government and the private sector. It's currently under construction, and the price for 1 kilowatt stood at around 4 cents. Now the same company is pitching again. They want to build another large power plant for even lower the cost per kilowatt. So we see there's a global trend, obviously, with the drop in the cost of producing solar panels, and that is obviously associated with the overall more cost efficient operation of solar power plants. So we increasingly see the trend of renewable energy being competitive with fossil fuel produced energy. And here Armenia has a huge potential of engaging private sector successfully through PPP models and others to make sure that we all benefit. And one other aspect as well, under Green Climate Fund's readiness program, which is implemented by the ministry's environmental project implementation unit. This year we applied for $700,000 grant to engage banking sector into climate projects. So this has been approved, and we're very much looking forward to engaging our banking community in climate related projects.
Yeah, thank you. And next question is to Ms. Lopez. Actually, we saw in the map of the opportunities and financial mechanisms, a lot of kind of different complicated systems which can be applied. Which you think is the most kind of applicable one considering the scale of our country and our such ambitious plans, but at least we need to show some short-term solutions, for the private sector, which of the showed on the map you see are most applicable.
Yeah, it actually depends on the type of actions that you want to implement. Because, for example, there are some of the financial mechanisms under the convention, such as the Global Environmental Facility, that have like allocations per country, and they replenish every 4 years. So it's pretty much very straightforward. You develop a project, and then that project is reviewed, and it goes. Then you have the Green Climate Fund that has a totally different logic, where you will need to. You don't have a country allocation, so on one hand, the country could potentially access as much resources as needed, but on the other hand, you do need to have a very strong project in order to compete with other high quality proposals at the global level. So in that sense, if you ask me, the Green Climate Fund, for example, is not an instrument to solve urgent and short-term needs, because it's a very long process. Usually it takes, in our experience, it takes around 2 years for a project to be approved. And then it starts implementation, and it can take 8 to 10 years to be implemented. So we're talking about, as Glenn also mentioned, we're talking about medium to long-term plans that could be developed. However, also you have a bilateral avenues to transit, and I think that also Irina mentioned that as one of the ideas that the government is exploring with that exchange mechanism, and I think that could be also potentially something that could be successful depending on the type of activity. So that's why I was saying that it's very relevant and very important to have a clarity on what the country wants to do and how you want to do it, because then everything else will align. You will find the partners to work with. Private sector will be interested. You will identify within the national domestic budget how that can be planned and implemented. So I think that what Diana said really was very important. The homework needs to be done first, and then you will have like a lot of attention and a lot of interest from the international community, and that's also the case of Costa Rica. Yes, they had a lot of pre-enabling conditions, but now that they have done a lot of work internally, there's money pouring on them from the international community to do a lot of projects and implement other types of measures. So I think that yes, it's going to take a little bit of effort at the national level to work on these initial enabling conditions, but then any of these financial instruments could be relevant if the right actions are identified.
Okay, thanks. And maybe the last question to Glenn. Actually, I know that you are working with the global impact investors in Boston area. So can you share your experience about their views? Yeah, actually, are they care about the impact, or it's kind of mostly impact washing? And what are the global trends? Yeah.
Yeah, some recent work that Woodside Research Centre has been conducting with a private investment management company has been really looking at climate risk on their investments, and there's increasing interest in this. I mean, mainly because these investment advisors are looking to climate-proof their investments for their clients, and so that's the kind of first tier of interest. What's most at risk, but they're increasingly aware about the uncontrollable risks of unhedgeable risk, if you like, of climate change. And they're now sort of also interested in, well, how do we divert some of these funds, which are, in tech stocks, in international industrial agriculture, you name it. How should we start thinking about spending some of these wisely to try and get either adaptation or mitigation outcomes, if in a sense, if you like, as an insurance premium on stabilizing the global climate. Now, so this is just one fund manager, but through a process of education led largely by this fund manager, others are jumping on board with the same ideas, and so now they're really seriously sort of thinking about how they can put a certain proportion of their assets or advise their clients to put a certain proportion of their assets into things like land funds or low emissions development funds. And so, I think this sort of private finance field is growing. So there's going to be more and more money coming online. But to get that money, you're going to have a really robust business case. And that comes from having good data about your plans and activities and expected impacts and outcomes. I think one thing I should sort of say is probably what I've been talking about sounds very expensive. And in some ways, if we treat it in a piecemeal way, it can be very expensive. So like the Green Climate Fund has its own set of metrics that it wants projects to report on. International Finance Corporation and the World Bank have their own set of performance metrics, and that's environmental as well as social safeguards. And each and every investor has their own little framework. And I think the trick is how do you develop a set of measurement approaches where you can just basically measure once and report twice to multiple different investors to try and keep costs down. And many of the performance metrics that we need to sort of have a look at are the sorts of things that you might actually be collecting anyway at a national level, or at least you ought to be if you aren't now. Things like living standards measurement surveys, which sort of help us to know about the impact of other development activities. So I think we need to have a very sort of joined up look at what we're trying to do with climate financing and make sure that our performance monitoring frameworks are well integrated with other government departments. And so that's something that we've been having a look at in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And through the Living Standards Measurement Survey, which is conducted every 5 years and is organised by the Ministry of Finance, there's a couple of pages, a couple of modules in there related to forests and environmental incomes and the use of different types of fuel woods and biomass, and that's sort of collected at a national level. And that's in the DRC, that's a $6 million endeavour just to do that one survey at the national level. And the cost of the sort of environmental module is about $400,000. But if the Ministry of Environment had to do it themselves, it would probably cost them $2 or $3 million to do a similar type of survey. So there's a big sort of efficiency gain there by having a little bit more of a coordination with other ministry activities.
Okay, thank you. And just the very last question today. I actually do believe that in nearest future, the Armenian private sector can really play a role in the solving the adaptation problems, climate adaptation problems in Armenia.
I think, as was mentioned by Glenn, the private sector is looking for reducing its risks, and the adaptation is also to reduce their risk for their investments. If they are doing investments in building something, and if there is a landslide due to deforestation, it's their risk, and so they have to be alarmed about this and to contribute to that. But one thing I want to mention also for the domestic work is many years ago in the forest law there was included that is allowed to have a private forest or community forest if the investments will be done by private sector or by community, and to have an ownership for this forest. There is need to analyze why these statements which were placed in the law was not working, and to understand how barriers to overcome. In this case, maybe the private sector also will be interested. We can't look on our reforestation with the short cycle wood production as, for example, in Congo or even in Costa Rica, our forest is becoming mature after 40, 50 years. So we have to think about selling the biodiversity value of our forest and other type of environmental benefits that private sector can also value in its greening image building. So there is need also to make the homework for doing this environmental valuation of the forest, which after the private sector can put in its reporting agenda that they benefited in increasing because used the local species of the planting, the animals return to this forest, as we have, for example, with so important year as we have for leopard, because the forest control in Khosrow was improved. So we have to understand other type of benefits to sell the Armenian very unique mountainous forests value as a asset in evaluation of private sector activities.
Okay, thank you very much. So one thing is clear: we need to join our efforts in order to meet the global challenges and also to implement our ambitious mega projects in Armenia. Thank you very much, and all we can achieve it together.